In 2015, the finance ministers gathered at the G20 created the TCFD, a commission designed to promote transparency in climate-related financial reporting. The committee looked at governance issues, strategy issues, and climate risk issues. In 2017, insurance banking supervisors and market authorities created a network called the NGFS, which focuses on the links between climate and financial stability. All these actors are now interested in climate change. Why? To live in a world compatible with the Paris Agreement, what does it mean? Let's remember the goals of the Paris Agreement. The 2015 Paris Agreement has 3 goals. The first goal is to keep the global temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius and pursue our efforts to keep it below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The second is to build resilience to climate change and promote a low-carbon development. The third goal is to align financial flows with the previous 2 goals. This implies that at the moment we are in a situation where financial flows are not fully aligned with the previous 2 goals. When we talk about limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius and even 1.5 degrees Celsius, this means reducing global greenhouse gas emissions to 0 in absolute terms by the end of the 21st century. The world as a whole will have to stop emitting greenhouse gases. The few remaining emissions will be balanced by an equivalent amount of CO2 capture. In conclusion, a certain number of activities, all economic activities, will have to change in order to become compatible with this net zero goal. There will not be room for everyone. Some activities are incompatible with such a world. Other activities will have to develop. But the question arises as to the compatibility of a net zero goal with a number of assets. For example, coal-fired power plants, combustion engine vehicles, agriculture as it is today, etc. The second goal is to promote resilience to climate change. Even at 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius of warming, we will have climate change impacts to manage. Impacts that may be diverse, but fundamentally, they will also have economic impacts. And we can also wonder about the impact on coal-fired power plants, for example, which need water to operate, on mobility, on transport infrastructures, and also on housing, on urban forms, and on agriculture. Physical risks result from the impact of climate change on economic agents. 3 examples of physical risk can be listed. First, for example, extreme events, the ones that make the headlines that we see on the 24-hour news channels. They can be storms, they can be droughts, they can be heavy rainfalls, and these things are going to have fairly obvious impacts on economic activity. On the one hand, because it can destroy infrastructure, by making them inoperable, which would generate a business loss, and then the infrastructure would have to be rebuilt to make it usable again. The second type of example is gradual changes in the climate over time. One example is the rise in temperature. We can think of the modification of water regimes, of the rise in sea level. Likewise, this will have an impact. If the sea level rises, infrastructure will have to be moved, perhaps decommissioned prematurely and rebuilt further away. If droughts are persistent, this may mean the displacement of agricultural activities, etc. The third example is climatic surprises, i.e., things that happen sometimes, but which occur at the wrong time or not at the time expected. And on the 24-hour news channels, this usually results in people being interviewed and saying, we've never seen that before. It can be heavy rainfalls in regions where there was none before. It can also be leaves that fall prematurely. Water stress. Leaves fall onto the tracks, and this slows down rail traffic, and therefore generates climatic impacts. It can be cold weather after a mild spring that generates agricultural losses. And once again, every time we see, we've never seen that before. We've never seen that here, or we've never seen that in this season. Tomorrow's climate is not going to be the same as today's. And I can even add that today's climate has already been affected by global warming. But it's going to get worse in the next few years. There will be more impacts, more climate surprises. In a word, we will have to be prepared and anticipate tomorrow's climate, which will have more frequent extreme events, which may be increased, which will also have shifting averages, warmer temperatures, etc., and perhaps surprises that will arrive gradually. Transition risks result from the impact of the transition to a net zero emission economy on economic actors. These risks can be of several kinds. One can think, for example, of public policy risks, which will modify policies and therefore modify the behavior of agents. There are also technological risks, i.e., the introduction of new technologies or the lowering of costs of competing technologies. We can also think of so-called market risks, i.e., changes in consumer or user preferences for goods produced by a company. To illustrate this, on the risks of public policies, we can think of the introduction of a carbon price that will increase the price of fossil fuels and make renewable energies more competitive. We can think of the introduction of standards on vehicles, the introduction of standards in land use planning, such as low-emission zones, etc. We can also think, if we look at the technological risks, of the eruption of new technologies. The somewhat emblematic example of the transition risk is Kodak. This is not at all linked to the ecological transition. Kodak disappeared because they didn't anticipate the arrival of a technology competing with film, which was digital. On the ecological transition, we could have the same type of thing, with notably price and costs reduction of renewables. We could have renewables that become much more competitive than other technologies, especially fossil fuels. A third example to illustrate the changes in market preference is the drop in meat consumption. Meat being considered, at least in developed countries, to be relatively incompatible on the scale we know today, with a world of 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we can see that consumers are tending to consume less meat, particularly red meat. The other example is the Flagskam. As you know, this stigma of taking the plane initiated in Scandinavia, which ultimately leads consumers to turn away from the plane on the basis of its incompatibility with a world of zero net emissions, a 2 degrees Celsius world. What we can see is that there are a certain number of assets and activities that will be incompatible with a 2 degrees Celsius to 1.5 degrees Celsius world. And in particular, we are not going to be able to extract all the fossil fuels in the ground if we want to respect the 2 degrees Celsius to 1.5 degrees Celsius barrier, which raises questions about the valuation of assets that use fossil fuels today. It's not just the companies that make their living from oil, but ultimately the whole economy. 80% of the energy we use is fossil energy, so our whole economy will be affected. And when we try to put a figure on the cost of these transition risks, the network of banking and insurance supervisors and market authorities also provide some answers. Their conclusion is that the more orderly the transition, the lower the costs. When we talk about an orderly transition, it simply means that it will be anticipated and taken into account by both the public authorities and economic agents. What can we learn from these elements of risk? We can take the problem from any angle. We will have to deal with both the transition risks and the climate risks. We cannot choose between both. We have to integrate both physical risks and transition risks. Whatever we do, we will have to deal with the transitional risks in order to be carbon neutral, with zero net emissions, and therefore to ensure that the climate does not warm up too much. And even if we manage to do that, we will also have to deal with the physical risk, with physical impacts that are to be expected, even in a world that warms by 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. So once again, no choice. We will need to handle both. It will be your mission to integrate them in your activities.